Hi, psychology classes. We are talking today about the major approaches of psychology, and this is the first of what will likely be 7 or 8 videos dealing with these different approaches of psychology. This is by far one of the most important concepts you will have throughout this course. This foundation basically is everything that we're going to build on from here. So if we get through the approaches and you understand it, you become a master at thinking like you're someone from each of these approaches. You are going to do awesome in every single unit that we have. If you struggle with these, we need to address that early on, because if you continue to struggle, you're going to struggle through a lot of our units. For those of you in AP psychology, these become the foundational pieces for so many answers. And as you start to break down multiple choice questions, you're going to start to see, with a basic understanding of the approaches, you can really start to break down and start to eliminate some of those bad distractor answers. I grabbed this quote on the board a long time ago, and I'm a huge believer in it. Anything that I've started to really explore deeply has found to be true. So when you first start to study a field, it's overwhelming because it seems like there's a zillion things out there that you need to try to memorize. In the course of AP psychology, we're talking about more than 500 words, 80 something people. It gets really big. But then when we really start to study it, it's not that big. There's core principles that govern everything. In this particular author says 3 to 12. In our case, there's 8, 9 if you include the research methodology. So you identify those core principles that govern everything that goes on in this field. And all of a sudden, those little things aren't so big and scary. They're just pieces of the big thing. And if you understand the big thing, the little ones are so much easier to understand. So that becomes the core understanding we are working with when we talk about these approaches, is trying to get to the core understanding of what psychology is all about. Now, psychology is one of the more divided fields out there. And so as one of the more divided fields, we have a lot of people that still argue about it. We know already that we're trying to scientifically study behaviors and mental processes. The issue is psychology has had such a rocky history, going through so many different waves of understanding, that they don't all agree on what the core understanding should be today. And so psychologists throughout the modern field have essentially taken one of these big approaches and lean more heavily towards one. Now, as we discussed previously, most psychologists do lean towards that eclectic approach, where they're going to take bits and pieces of the ones that fit best. And each approach sticks around because each approach is better equipped to answer certain types of problems more so than the other approaches are. And so that's why there hasn't been a clear resolution for this. So the way this video series is going to work from here is each video will focus in on one approach. And what I ask for you is, while we understand that modern psychologists will often take ideas from multiple approaches, we're going to go all in. And what I want from you is to be able to create the ability to be able to break your thinking and compartmentalize it into these approaches. So when we start in this video with the biological approach, I want you all to be able to separate all the other influences that could be there, all the other ways to explain behaviors and mental processes, and really hone in on, this is how a biological approach psychologist is going to understand this behavior and mental process, and then how they're going to treat these behaviors and mental processes. So let's get into the biological approach. So every single one of these is going to be formatted in this way. We're going to introduce who founded it, who are the people that we need to be responsible for knowing, but then what is the bottom line? And that's really what we're trying to cut down into, is if we're studying behaviors and mental processes, why do we have behaviors and mental processes? And the short answer from the biological approach is, everything we do and everything we think is a result of biological processes. And with examples, we want to make sure we're adding a few subpoints within that also. So let's start in with the first biological process of your genes and your heredity. we know, I hope you know from science classes leading up till right now, that you have a certain genetic code that has built you to be who you are. It expresses how you look on the outside, but it also has a lot of influence on the way that you interact with your world and the way that you think. And so, if I pull a little bit of a goofy example, um, in some of the studying of the human genetic code, they have found a gene that has been linked with bad driving. And so, we can humorously call it the bad driver gene. That's not it. It's not a gene that is always there dictating that you're going to be a bad driver. But as we start to look at what genetic traits could make you a good driver versus a bad driver, and if we look and say 1/3 of the population has a bad driver gene, well, what would make someone a bad driver? So maybe someone has the ability to focus for longer periods of time. Maybe they're able to have a greater awareness of what's happening around them. Maybe it becomes the ability of being able to plan ahead and be able to predict what other drivers on the road are going to do. Um, but it comes down to, when we're measuring, people with this gene have more accidents than people who have a different expression of that gene. So um, we know that your genes have such an influence on what they are, and the research pendulum is largely swinging towards biology as one of these huge factors for what we're doing. We're finding more and more influences of genes and hereditable influences on what how you think and how you express yourself. Another supporting piece on this genetic side is research overwhelmingly shows that if you take an adopted child and you compare their personality traits to the people that have lived with them their entire life and influenced them and raised them, or their biological parents, that adopted child will show more similarity with the adopted or with their biological parents that they've never met than the adoptive parents who they have spent their entire life with. So a lot of biology is still at play, and we are starting to see more and more that genes are a really big deal in how we think and understand and behave. So one of the other influences that we can start to see here is um, your chemicals and hormones in your body. And we have so many chemicals and hormones going through our body all of the time. As we get into the biological processes, we'll explore these a lot more, and we'll look at what are these different chemicals and what do these chemicals do. But we know that an increase in chemicals will result in a change in behaviors, a change in mental processes. If we just gravitate towards something like serotonin, if you have normal levels of serotonin, then your emotional state is relatively stable. You're going to have normal ups and downs. But we know that as you start to feel, as serotonin increases, you will start to feel happier. If serotonin decreases, you will start to feel less happy. If serotonin goes below a certain threshold and stays there, we fall away from being sad, and all of a sudden you are clinically depressed. And that's going to start to change things. In addition to your mood, we're going to see it changing your energy levels, your motivation levels. And all this is just because of um, a chemical that's starting to change in levels. When you look at how do we treat something like depression, the entire goal of, or the entire biological treatment, I should say, of treating depression is, let's find a drug that's going to increase serotonin. And in a whole lot of people suffering from depression, you give an SSRI, is the most common type of antidepressant, and that stands for selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. And we'll explore that a lot later, but the bottom line of what that does is you have more serotonin in your brain, and so all of those things of depression start to reverse. You start to feel more energy, you start to feel more motivated, your mood increases. And this is just us hyper focusing on one chemical. When we look at the fact that you have hundreds of them, many of them we haven't even studied enough to know what they do very well yet. These have a huge influence on everything that we're doing. And we can't even think or move without these chemicals having a chain reaction through our brains and bodies. So if those chemical processes start to change, we will start to see our behaviors and mental processes changing as a result. The last thing that we see here is neural and electrical activity. So especially if we focus on neural activity in the brain. So these girls that are behind my floating head are experimenting with a machine that if you activate electricity, the girl over on our left, her arm moves without any control of her own. And so there's devices now where we can stimulate your body or your brain electrically, and we can create behaviors, in this case of moving the hand, or even alter mental processes. There is a device now where it's called a transcranial magnetic stimulation, where we can essentially use magnets to deactivate small portions of the brain, and in doing so we can actually deactivate your ability to do certain things. So one of the classic examples we'll see a little bit later on in the semester is we can actually turn off the human ability to speak temporarily just by turning off that part of the brain. And so as we start to study more and more of this, we're starting to realize more and more that every thought, every behavior, every emotion you've ever had boils down to a neuron spraying some of these chemicals to another neuron, which then sprays some more chemicals to another neuron. And that combination of electrical activity in your brain with these chemicals results in a lot of your thoughts and behaviors and mental processes, to the point that an extreme biological approach will come out and say, yeah, everything we are is just biological processes. There are a couple hyperlinks here, and I would like to point you towards my website to explore those a little bit. The first one is on the website. It's called something about movie reconstruction. And that was several years ago. I'm sure the technology has improved since then. But that video is showing you on one side, and you can see on the screen as well. On one side, they are showing someone a video clip. And so that's the clear image you see on the left in the blue box. On the right is if we hook your brain up to a machine that can actively read your brain as it's processing things, we can now start to reconstruct what it seems like you are seeing. And you will see as you look through this video, some of these are like right on, and some of them look like it's kind of missed the mark. And that's because it's still an emerging science. They're still trying to figure this out. But we're getting to the point that electrical activity is such a clear indicator of what you're thinking that we can actively start to read your brain while you are thinking. We can now predict movements a tenth of a second before your body actually moves just by reading neural activity. And using that train of thought, now we end up with what's labeled as World Cup 1 and 2. And the next one, look at World Cup kicked off by electronic bodysuit or something like that. And what you're going to see there is a demonstration in 2014 where this Walk Again project has created a bodysuit that only reads, they find a paraplegic person and they read their brain. And in reading their brain, they can now say, oh, I'm getting the command to move, which due to an injury or something that has happened along those patients' lives, that message can't leave the brain to get to the body. And so now they can hook them up to this essentially exoskeleton, read the brain that says, hey, make this leg move. And it can now do so just by reading brain activity. The second video is an update from that same project, and you can see how much more advanced that's gotten. Don't feel like you necessarily need to watch the entire second video, but it does just show how technology is pushing so far. So a recap here before we start applying. Everything and biological approach, every thought or emotion or feeling or behavior is coming down to your genes and heredity, your chemicals and hormones, and electrical activity in your brain and body. So for every single one of these, we're going to use this example to help practice applying it. So now you can see one question on the board. According to the biological approach, why would this guy go and wrestle a grizzly bear? And we're going to use this example of wrestling a grizzly bear for all of our approach videos so we can see that consistency and see how we are breaking apart our thinking, compartmentalizing it into these approaches. So what I want you to do is pause this video, and I want you to come up with a good, solid answer for this. So once again, you're going to come up with your own answer using only the biological approach's way of thinking to why is this guy wrestling a grizzly bear? So go ahead and hit pause, and I will discuss answers with you after you have paused this and thought about it. So pause. So hopefully you've paused this and you're coming back with a good solid answer. And I'd like you to compare your answer to some of the most common ones I hear when we're able to do this in person. So there's a couple ways we could start to take this answer. One of the common ways we could take this answer is there's some sort of genetic thing in his family that leads him to either need to express himself through brute strength. Maybe he has been given a lot of strength down through his genetic line. And we would express this by saying things like, well, his parents were bear wrestlers, as were his grandparents. And so there's some sort of genetic trait about wrestling this bear that has just been passed down. And that's why this guy goes to wrestle bears, but the rest of us don't usually go and do that. Another example that we might often see is maybe he has just a surge of testosterone, and testosterone being one of those chemicals and hormones that can influence our behavior. And testosterone is one that has been linked with aggression. So maybe he's having a rush of aggression because of this testosterone, and since there's nothing else that can compete to it, he's going to go after the bear. Another chemical and hormone thing that we could start to approach is maybe he's not thinking straight because of chemicals and hormones that have entered his body. So the biological approach is also going to really utilize drugs as a means of not just treatment, but also explaining other behaviors. So maybe he has ingested some sort of foreign chemical that would influence his behavior in a different way. And so he's not thinking the way he normally does, which is making him go and make a choice like deciding to go wrestle a grizzly bear. So this is the biological approach. As always, if you have more questions or if you would like to clarify one of your answers, if it didn't quite line up with what we talked about, feel free to reach out to me. I am happy to make sure you have as good of an understanding of the biological approach as we possibly can at this introductory level during this time in the course. Thank you. Hope to see you soon.